Major funding for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. And by Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Character matters, doesn't it? It seems like the more we discuss and extol the virtues of character, the less it seems to be evident in actual practice in everyday life. Thank you for watching North and South Carolina's most widely watched source for regional business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and you may ask, what does character really have to do with our institutional business and our broader public policy? Well, arguably everything. So this time on CBR, a special two-part discussion about our collective public conscience. Where does it reside? And who is the standard bearer? We begin our decidedly ecclesiastical panel in just a moment.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, health care, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising health care costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Dr. Tony Beam of Christian Worldview Center at North Greenville University, Dr. Bill Jeffries of Providence United Methodist Church, Reverend Pat Jobe of Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Greenville, Rabbi Judy Schindler of Temple Bethel, and Dr. Douglas Otati of Davidson College.
Hello, welcome to our program, a special two-part program. It's more than character. It's really about this whole thing we like to call the public conscience. So, Rabbi Schindler, you're going to get the first pitch, for better or for worse. Judy, who is the keeper of the public conscience?
Well, I wouldn't be so arrogant as to say religious leaders are the sole keeper of the public conscience. I think in this society with social media, everyone can be that soul that calls the question, says, what are we doing? How are we off track? But at the same time, it is religious leaders who teach about character, who preach about character, who have studied character. And my faith, for instance, Judaism, has thousands of years of teaching on what it means to be of character and to keep that public conscience. So I think that we do have a very significant role in being that keeper of the public conscience and asking the hard questions. As religious leaders, I like to say our job is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable, to be that prophetic voice that speaks to power and challenges power in a fearless way.
You know, Bill, Judy talks about asking the tough questions and making people, pushing them, making them feel uncomfortable. Do you find that is that your role?
I think so. I think you need both. Someone there, I see our role a lot of times to speak for those who don't have a voice. A lot of times in the power struggles that go on in the community, the people without power get lost and forgotten. So to have the prophet position as well as the conscience position, where you're trying to address the needs of those who are among our community but often forgotten.
Go back to Rabbi Schindler for just a second, Tony. Judy makes a good case about this idea that we're not so arrogant to think that we are the ones where it resides. What role does a preacher have, a congregation have to the larger community when it comes to this idea of a public conscience?
Well, I think to know the truth and to try to live and by example to live out the truth in the community with integrity. When I think about being the keeper of the public conscience, so when you said that a minute ago, it reminded me of what Benjamin Franklin said, supposedly, when he was asked about what we now have after the Constitutional Convention, and he said, well, you have a republic if you can keep it. And so the keeping of the republic was handed over to the responsibility of the people. So, I think those of us as religious leaders have a responsibility to give information, truth, teaching live an example of that teaching out in the community, encourage others to do so. But it's the people every day that build relationships with each other and interact in the marketplace. They're the ones that actually become the keepers of the conscience. And there's so many voices that are trying to get their attention about what is right and wrong that sometimes it's hard to be heard above the din of the media and the social networking and all the things out there that sort of become competitors for the voice of the conscience.
And we're gonna talk more about the noise around the message and how the message doesn't get drowned out in whatever the message is. Pat, thoughts?
Bill alluded to people who are powerless, and Ann Wilson Schaff says that the most dangerous myth in America today is powerlessness. I think an awful lot of people feel that they don't have the kind of power that Tony just described. I think he's right, that power is there with the choices that we make, with the things that we buy, with the ways we treat each other. But I think so many people see themselves as being cogs in such a huge machine that they have no power, and that's disastrous.
Doug, I want to take this in a little bit different way. One of the dialogues we've had on this program ad nauseum, it seems like, but we have them in cocktail parties and over lunch tables and around the dinner table at night, is the challenge or the lack of what we think is there a lack of political will and moral courage when it comes to our moral leaders. I guess the question, and you seem, in religious and faith studies at Davidson, you seem a perfect person to ask this to. How do we is it the role of a pastor or a rabbi or a congregation to hold political leadership responsible for the lack of what they're doing or what they are doing?
I think that congregations do have a role, and an important role. My tendency is to think that, by and large, what religion contributes to policy discussions is a kind of worldview or a kind of position on some very, very basic questions about human life and from which follow certain values. And I think those are important. I think the role of politics is to make tougher calls about particular matters in light of very specific information, so that I don't think that most of the time religious convictions dictate complete policies. So let's take, for example, something along the lines of immigration policy or something like that. I expect that a number of us here could agree that a test of the justice of a society is how it treats the stranger within its gates. It's, after all, a biblical point. I think we could probably also agree that the way you treat the most dependent of the strangers within your gates is an especially poignant test of justice, say the children of immigrants. Now, that's not a policy on what to do about immigration, but it's an important enough point. That is, do the policymakers in this country pay sufficient attention to the stranger within our gates and the most dependent of the strangers within our gates? That's something I think any religious leader almost can bring up. We don't want to determine the policy. I don't know whether it means you have a big, wall at the border or what it means, but it's an important point.
Well, there's always going to be the debate between justice and mercy when it comes to dealing with issues like that. Mercy has to be extended, as you said. I agree. I think the Bible's spoken very clearly about the way that we're to treat the stranger and the alien in the land, as the Scripture says in the King James Version. But, I actually, in New American Standard, by the way, is my preferred translation. But I actually think that there has to be a balance with these people are elected and officials are given the responsibility to enforce the law that we all agree upon. So if there's a problem, the problem needs to be addressed by having the laws changed, not by ignoring the laws.
I think this is exactly right, and I think what religious leadership ought to be doing is pressing people about the morality of the laws. And in particular, at this point, the question of justice and the most dependent of the strangers within your gates.
Oh, okay, so whose responsibility? Judy, is that your responsibility, or is that the larger body of the temple's responsibility to rise up, or are you meant to be the one that pressures these politicos to make that change?
We are on the sidelines in many ways, watching society unfold, and we're the ones saying, you know what, that policy decision is way off base. That's not aligned with the values that we feel that are critical to our country, the pluralistic democratic values and the values of justice and mercy and the equality and dignity of all human beings. So when our society is going off course, right, like it did in the economic downturn and prior to that, it's up to us as religious leaders to say we're heading off base here. Really, we've lost our moral compass and we need to get back on track. In terms of the actual getting back on track, how do we do that? Well, there's a lot of different ways in which we do that. We might be the preachers of the sermon, but actually the policy level of getting back on track, I don't think that's the role of the clergy of congregations. Now, I come from a movement, so we bring resolutions to our movement. We vote on resolutions, and we have a group in Washington that would work to lobby and to get involved in the nuances of a policy to make sure that it is affirming the values that we hold most central, such as human dignity and equality.
Do we try to have political answers for moral questions? And let me give you a case in point. This is pretty broad, and Doug, you would probably know this. Is, you know, depending on what side of the aisle you're on, Republican or Democrat, you're going to feel pretty strongly about this particular issue. Republicans feel like they don't want to be compelled to give to any social program to support any, in general. Democrats feel like they should be because we don't do it out of the goodness of our heart, so it's got to come from somewhere. So that's an example of a social program that we're trying to find a social and a moral issue that we're trying to find a political answer for. Bill, Doug?
Bill, go ahead.
I think that happens a lot, and the issues can really get jumbled. I see our role in the religious community more as Judy's describing, where we're trying to remind people who we are and what we have been in the community as religious people. But at the same time, we need to also address the issue itself and not to try to politicize it in some way. And that's hard to do. But if we can keep our eyes on what the goal is, sometimes we can get there.
The problem, though, is that the system is so money-driven. And I think the voice of ethics, which Doug teaches, the voice of morality that we've all been talking about, is lost in a sea of money.
So when you're driving home after temple or after church, you just we're all going to hell. And I'm not saying that
our faith doesn't believe in hell, just for the record.
But what I'm saying is, do you feel like you're not winning this battle and it's going in the wrong direction? Not to be too generalistic here.
If I might say, I think an awful lot of political discourse in this country these days is no longer political discourse. It's essentially religious discourse, and that doesn't help the country much. I think that religious discourse has to do with basic worldviews and values. And then I think policy questions have to do with very particular questions about how to enact those things. So if we take something like care for the poor, which has not been mentioned sufficiently in the current presidential season at all, I don't think, and which religious leaders ought to bring to the fore, saying that we ought to care for the poor and pay attention to how the poor are being treated in this country is not the same thing as endorsing an entire policy. The policy needs to be worked out by the politicians, which is, after all, why they are being compensated and paid money. So that's their job. The job of the religious leader, I think, is not to come up with a detailed policy all the time, but to articulate the values that have to do with the public conscience. And goodness knows religious leaders are not the only keepers of the public conscience.
Yeah, not to come up with a policy, I agree. But I think to lay the foundation or the groundwork by which the policymakers make good decisions, to have the right thinking, I guess, or thinking that is based on a morality, right and wrong, to make decisions about how these things get carried out. Because right now, I don't think politicians are making decisions based on right and wrong.
Exactly.
I think they're making decisions based on what's best for the moment and what's best for their careers and what's best to get them reelected. And it gets in the way.
Donors are.
It gets in the way of everything that could be done right in our society. And that needs to change.
And in fact, I think too often they get away with talking about their most dearly held convictions and not detailing the policies that they want to enact. I'm interested in their convictions, but I'm not interested only in their convictions. They're politicians, for goodness sake. The reason I vote for them is so that they can work on the intricacies of policy, not because they can articulate convictions. I'd like them to do that. I know plenty of people can articulate convictions. So one of the problems I think we have is that politics has turned into theology, and it's not to the credit of either at that point.
So faith without works is dead. We could go to James.
Right.
Give me an example of what your convictions. I hear your convictions. Now show me your convictions.
Now show me how that's embodied in policy.
Judy?
Yes.
Well, it's just, do I drive home and think, you know, we're all going to a bad place, whatever that place is, that hell-like place? I don't, because there is so much good in the world. There is so much good that we are striving to do on a congregational basis, on a community basis, statewide, and we're just working our way. But the rhetoric is so disheartening and is so dangerous, because when you devalue someone, you demonize them, and ultimately it leads to a very negative place. And there is so much danger in our words and the power of our words. So we have the Democratic National Convention coming to Charlotte in September. We're all well aware of that. So as clergy, we created a sermon exchange, right? We try to get...
This is the clergy in Charlotte?
The clergy in Charlotte.
How many involved in that, roughly?
Mecklenburg Ministries, we probably have 60 clergy, 60 congregations switching pulpits, right? But not with the one who believes the way we do. We switch, I mean, we would have a very interesting pulpit exchange, I am certain, right? Where so we go across lines of difference, whatever that difference might be. It might be racial or religious or socioeconomic, and we challenge people to look at the world differently. But the theme of this year's sermon exchange is the power of words. Words have tremendous power. With words, worlds were created, and with words are destroyed. And so I think that politicians have lost an understanding of the impact of their words and the danger of their words to create divisiveness in our community. And that's when I get despairing.
Do you ever get discouraged to the point of despair about that type of thing?
The rhetoric and the dialogue and the political process is very disturbing when people's goals are to, demonize the other in the political realm. I think it's just an ineffective political process.
As a radio talk show host, I mean, I'm in the middle of what can be a very explosive, very divisive, very heated environment. And what I try to do with my radio show is to talk about these sensitive issues without allowing the rhetoric to heat up or become hateful. And I try to keep the haters away from I mean, I've shut people down on my show. If somebody comes on and they're obviously, I have one caller who's is absolutely anti-Semitic. And once I've found that out and could discern that, we shut that down. If we've got to be able to talk about these things. We need to be able to talk about them in a public forum. We need to be able to sit down like we're doing here and have open discussions about the problems that we all are suffering with, and be able to come to some type of way out of the woods of our distress, so to speak. And the only way we can do that, I mean, I actually agree that we have to find ways to speak to each other with respect and grace and hear each other out in order to do that.
Bill, Pat, Thomas Jefferson once said that I fear for my country at the thought that God is just. And yeah, it is kind of funny. And the fact that some of the infighting that goes on now was just as acute in the Founding Fathers. How do we find that place, that I'm not going to call it a safe place, but a respectful place, and the place that at least we have enough grace to extend to one another to not disagree, at least violently? How do we find that spot? Is it at a church, a synagogue? Is it at some community forum where it's run by some type of clergy or person of faith? How do we find that?
Well, I'd hope that we would find it in the church. That's why we call them sanctuaries, that it's a safe place to come and be with God and with each other. My experience has been that the demonizing comes mainly when we don't personalize the issue. We're talking about those people, and once you put a name and a situation before someone, you usually get to the crux of the issue, and people end up trying to work something out. But as long as it's them or out there, it's easy to get polarized.
You were nodding what?
There was a famous case in North Carolina years ago where a Klan leader had committed a crime against a some icon in the black community, and a judge in Winston-Salem ordered the Klan leader and the female head of this black organization to have lunch together for like 12 weeks in a row. And as part of his sentence, he had to eat lunch with this woman 12 weeks in a row. And they became fast friends. They discovered their common humanity. And, you know, there are just so many stories like that where people are not demonizing groups, but they're meeting as individuals and talking and exchanging. And
So where's the magic formula in you look like you want to answer.
Well, I think it's, you know, we can sit on a stage or stand before podiums as political leaders and focus only on what divides us, right? But if we could pick areas where we're united, areas in which we can work together. I mean, we are very diverse. Here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg with the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of congregations. We have a vast difference of opinions on lots of topics, but we work together beautifully on affordable housing. And then there are some of us who work together on other issues, and we have to find those points of commonality on Israel, on all sorts of issues, on immigrant issues. So we have to find those points of commonality also where we can work together. I mean, that's what the politicians need to do in order to create policy that works for our countries. They ultimately do need to work together, and maybe a greater litmus test should be where they find commonality as they find differences, to see who's the best ability to work with the other, even when they're on the other side of the political spectrum.
I think this is very important. I think in some respects we could say that this country is now involved in a kind of new pluralism, It's not really just a collection of different sorts of Puritans in Massachusetts anymore. It's not just Protestant, Catholic, Jew from the 1950s in Will Herberg's book. It's also Muslim, Hindu, people who are spiritual but not religious, people who are none of the above and adamantly so, and so forth. So under those circumstances, there is a plurality of different views and values. One big question is, where are the overlaps? Where are the significant commonalities? Can we figure out where they are? We're not going to agree about everything, but we might agree about some things, such as care for the poor, attention to the poor, attention to health care for persons who cannot afford it, things like this. How those things are enacted become matters of policy, and there can be all sorts of differences about that, but we can find some commonalities. I think that's one very important thing. And I think the other very important thing is the qualities of discourse in the country right now publicly are not very good. There aren't very many places that people go where they don't simply agree with the person right next to them and simply articulate their convictions again. The articulation of common convictions by people of like minds is important, but it's not yet the kind of discourse one needs. So,
yeah, right. Before you answer that, Judy, let me make a point, because you're talking about reaching across the aisle to each other. When we were putting this program together, and I hope none of you take this personally, but you weren't always our first pick. And the reason being is, if you notice, there's not a Muslim on this panel. We tried. Right. And it's not about them. We tried to get other Protestants on this panel, some Catholics on this panel. Right. We could not get them. And some of it was date, but some of it was, why do I want to go do that? Why do I want to expose myself to that? And it's not that I'm not glad that you're here. My point is, it was very difficult. We've been working on this particular program for months, and trying to get people of different faiths to sit down was a tough thing to do. So, if that's the case for a program like this, how are you going to embrace one another in a community when you're on the front line?
Well, maybe it has to start with something like this. Now, look, I was very nervous about coming to do this program.
And you're on radio in the upstate.
And I deal with controversial subjects every day. But sitting down in this forum like this, as I read about some of the things that I had about you and about you, the two of you, I thought, where in the world are we going to find an opportunity to discuss this in a way that is going to be positive? But at the same time,
the Hebrew prophets.
Yes.
There's our common ground.
We agree on those people.
We call that the First Testament.
That's right. But I began a conversation with you about Israel, because I knew that would be a place where we would probably have some connection, because I have a passion for Israel, and I'm sure you do as well. And we discovered that we have a background together, that we grew up in the same town. And as we talk about those things, we become a little bit more comfortable to begin to move to other topics, and we gain respect for each other before we begin to dive into some of the issues that can be divisive. And I think when we get to those issues, we have to be willing to give each other a little bit of grace.
Tony, and we're going to have to, and, you know, we're out of time, at least for part one, but you know what, you're right. We're going to keep you together, as uncomfortable as it might be, for yet another half hour on the program. So stay with us. Thank you for joining us. Next week on this program, we're going to continue this dialogue. It's more than just character. It's more than just the public conscience. It's about which way we need to be going as a society within the faith point of view. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina, who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.